This is a PS video for those who I sent a video earlier, or maybe a new audience. But this is also showing you how you're able to use ChatGPT to write stuff for you that you were able to only write years ago. It took you maybe years to write, or months, or weeks, or days. Or maybe you could have rented or hired a freelance writer, a ghost writer, for, I don't know, 75 bucks per 100 letters or sentences, or some astronomical amounts of money compared to what you can do with ChatGPT now. With all respect to the writers, obviously, they earn their money, so they're well worth their money. But basically, when you prompt ChatGPT with an issue that I'm very intrigued with, the right way, it writes a fantastic, compelling story. So I prompted ChatGPT by just asking it to write a very compelling story about the bank industry screwing us over with the CBDC, the central bank digital currency trick, and how they on purpose flood the markets with huge loans with their worthless fiat currencies, then create huge inflation, after which they call the loans back that people cannot pay back anymore, leaving them with huge debts, claiming back the assets they loaned money for in the first place, now using those twice sold assets as collateral for their new scam, the new CBDC central bank digital currency, selling it for the second time with huge profits to yet another generation of victims of their white-collar criminals, using horrible also mental health pandemics and disgusting wars that were mostly intentionally started this way as mass murder bait to lure people in yet another trap. So that's the prompt. So I must admit, if you prompt ChatGPT well, it will give you a good result. If you prompt it poorly, without character or certain accents or words, then it will not write for you that way. So the better you prompt the ChatGPT bot, the better. And this is the story it wrote. Okay, here it goes. It is literally almost like a small how do you say it, article, or you can use this as a blog with links in it. But this is the story that it wrote. With the headline, "The Grand Deception, a story of fiat currency, CBDCs, and the modern economic trap." It all started with a sleight of hand, invisible to the average person. The world had been lured into a false sense of security, believing in the strength of banks and the seemingly endless promise of wealth. But lurking beneath this illusion was a trap so complex, so nefarious, that it was decades in the making. The banks, I mean, what I'm reading right now, it wrote in no more than, I think, 20 seconds. 20 seconds for this article. 20 seconds. I should have recorded it live. Perhaps with the next article, I'll record it live, that you can see the speed in which ChatGPT writes. So it continues by having read, the banks had mastered their craft, learning to manipulate the system through one central dangerous tool, fiat currency. It was money created out of thin air, unbacked by anything tangible, controlled solely by the central banks. The masses were none the wiser, trusting that their dollars, euros and yen held real value. In truth, their currencies were as fragile as paper houses, ready to collapse at the first strong gust of wind. How cool is that? I mean, it really makes you feel like you're an economist. Now it continues by writing, the flood, like another how do you say it? Another part of this story, you know. The flood. You could also feed this text, by the way, as a little side note. You could also feed this text into other AI software in order to let it read for you or to make a video of it. Like AI is now really taking over the whole world when it comes to marketing, giving us the opportunity to create the wildest things. Okay, so it continues to read. It continues to read. The trick was also, the trick was as old as time. Flood the market. Central banks and their commercial accomplices printed billions, no trillions of fiat currency. They pumped it into the economy through loans, mortgages, credit cards and business investments. Every man, woman and corporation was tempted to take on debt because money was cheap. Interest rates were low, and why not borrow when the central banks promised endless growth? After all, house prices were skyrocketed, stock markets soared to record highs, and people felt wealthier than ever before. But this was the first step in the con. It was an engineered boom. Banks knew full well that this flood of fiat currency would lead to massive inflation, devaluing everything in its wake. The more currency they injected, the less it was worth. People didn't see it immediately because wages kept rising and the illusion of prosperity persisted. Yet, behind closed doors, the same banks were already plotting their next move. They knew that the bubble would eventually burst because they had designed it to do so. Inflation surged, prices for basic goods soared, and suddenly those who had borrowed heavily were finding it harder and harder to keep up. Interest rates crept up, and just as planned, the tide turned. Next chapter, the callback. Then came the call. The banks, under the guise of maintaining financial stability as an excuse, demanded their loans to be repaid. But in an economy now ravaged by inflation, repayment became impossible. People who had once felt wealthy saw their assets, homes, businesses, investments crumble under the weight of their debt. The banks knew full well that the majority couldn't repay. They had to. It is really like chapters, like the callback is a chapter and could be a chapter for a new Netflix series. I'm preparing myself to make a Netflix series of all the adventures that we went through, like literally adventures that I haven't seen on Netflix yet. Crazy stuff the last 10, 15 years, the last 30, 40 years. So anyway, the next chapter, the callback, maybe I'm repeating myself, but then came the call. The banks, under the guise of maintaining financial stability, so to speak, demanded their loans be repaid, but in an economy now ravaged by inflation, repaying became impossible. People had once felt wealthy, saw their assets, homes, businesses, investments crumble under the weight of their debt. The banks knew full well that the majority couldn't repay. They had never intended for them to. They have never intended for them to. So one by one, people defaulted, and maybe you can find yourself in these stories. Maybe you're a business owner or an investor that lost everything. So people defaulted. Their homes, their very homes they had borrowed to purchase were repossessed. Small businesses went under. Their owners left bankrupt. The assets were seized, real estate, land, even people's savings, everything that had been built by borrowing the bank's worthless fiat money now belonged to those very banks. The people who had worked their entire lives had nothing. The labor, their sacrifices had been stolen, and the banks laughed as they reclaimed the very assets they had sold in the first place. Now next chapter, the new game, CBDCs, their new game. But that wasn't the end of the scam. No, it was only the beginning. Once the banks had their hands on these assets for the second time, they introduced the next phase of their grand plan, the central bank digital currency, the CBDCs. Sold as the solution to the mess they themselves have created, the CBDC was touted as a more secure, transparent and modern form of money. The public, beaten down by inflation and debt, desperate for stability, welcomed it with open arms. It's like my child abuser. Anyway, most victims go back to their perpetrator. That's the crazy that's the crazy psychology state of mind that you end up having been abused majorly. So now, what they didn't know, the people, that this new digital currency was just another trick. This time the banks weren't even pretending. The CBDC was fully controlled by the central banks, giving them unprecedented power over people's finances. Every transaction was tracked, every movement of money monitored. If they didn't like what you spent your money on, they could freeze your account. If they wanted to impose negative interest rates to force you to spend, they could do so with the click of a button. And the asset, those homes, businesses and properties they had repossessed during the great inflation crisis, they were sold back to the next generation of victims at inflated prices using the new CBDC. The banks had managed to sell the same assets twice, first using fiat currency and now with their shiny new digital system. But this time they had even more control. The CBDC wasn't just about making money, it was about total economic domination. The next chapter with the headline that ChatGPT wrote is the deeper deception, war and mental health pandemics. To mask the horror of what they had done, the banks and their allies in government turned to the oldest playbook in history, war and chaos. Conflict erupted across the globe, often sparked by false pretenses. These wars were designed not just for political power but for economic distraction, as men and women were sent off to die on distant battlefields. The public was kept too terrified to notice the economic chains being placed around their necks. And for those who stayed behind, the mental toll was staggering. The constant anxiety, financial instability and fear created a mental health pandemic, one that further weakened the masses. Depression, anxiety and suicide rates surged. But even this was part of the plan. A mental broken population is a controllable one. The banks and governments offered solutions, medications, therapy, even universal basic income. But each of those solutions came with strings attached. Accept the help, but only if you accept the terms of the new economic order. The wars, the mental health crisis, the inflation, all were part of a grander design. A design to weaken, manipulate and control. And at the heart of it all was the banking cartel, using fiat money and CBDCs to rob the world blind. Then it finishes up with the last chapter called The Trap Titans. By the time the dust settled, entire nations were enslaved. The population, now reliant on central banks' digital currency, had no freedom left. With every transaction, they were watched, monitored and controlled. The assets once owned by the public were now locked behind the walls of financial institutions. The wars had left scars, both physical and mental, on multiple generations. The banks, meanwhile, grew richer, fatter and more powerful than ever before. They had sold the world a lie, first of fiat money and then with CBDCs. They had created the very crisis they claimed to solve, and worst of all, they had done it all in plain sight, using the machinery of government, media, and churches and financial systems to trick people into thinking this was simply the way of the world. But it wasn't. It was theft. It is theft. A con of the highest order. And the worst part, most people didn't even realize they had been robbed until it was far too late. So here you go. ChatGPT. How about it? So my call to action is if even 10% of this is true, if even 1% of this is true, you should click on the links somewhere below this YouTube video or in the comments to see alternative ways of creating wealth and health and happiness that we're launching worldwide as well. So here you go. Hope I inspired you, and I hope I how do you say it, entertained you, and I hope I also inspired you to use ChatGPT to make a point. I mean, we're literally in the age of AI helping us spreading the word and yeah, just sharing viewpoints. This is just a viewpoint. This is not financial advice. I'm certainly not a financial advisor. I'm not your financial advisor. Don't want to be. And these videos are only for entertainment and education and sharing a viewpoint and some how do you say it? Education and entertainment and information. And that's it. And I'll see you and yours thanks to the more viable, realistic, decentralized projects that we're launching. Definitely in the most wonderful resorts, top hotels worldwide, and on the most beautiful beaches of the world, because that lifestyle is there for you too. Not only for those banksters and politicians and con artists and criminals, but that lifestyle is there for you too, and you're more and more than worth it. I'll see you there.